I'm Ron Kessler for Newsmax TV, and we're here with Condoleezza Rice on the publication of her new book, No Higher Honor. And it's a great honor for you to join us, and congratulations.
Thanks a lot. It's good to be with you.
It's a very candid book, and I think that's, the number one ingredient to a successful memoir. After World War I, Hitler rearmed. We allowed him to rearm, and now Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. Why shouldn't we just take out their nuclear facilities?
Well, obviously, the President of the United States should always keep that option on the table, and President Bush kept that option on the table. But it's easier said than done with Iran. The Iranians have made certain that population centers would be implicated in any such attack, and I think many have always worried that that might push the Iranians and their regime closer together rather than separating them. And so instead, everyone has tried diplomacy, increasingly tough diplomacy with the Iranians, and now with some of the weaknesses in that regime, we can always hope that there's a good chance to bring it down.
They've made it clear that population centers would be implicated, meaning?
Meaning the way that they've placed Natanz, which is not that far from major population centers.
Right. That pretty much sums it up.
Yes.
Looking at the democracy movement in the Middle East, which President Bush, of course, advocated, what would you have done differently, or what do you think he would have done differently in handling some of the hotspots? Well,
I'm very grateful that we put ourselves, thanks to President Bush, on the right side of this issue back with his second inaugural address in 2004, and then I gave a speech in 2005, and then I gave a speech in 2005 talking about the importance of a freedom agenda. We tried to get our friends to reform before their people were in the streets, because when people are in the streets, revolution and reform are not pretty, and it's pretty chaotic in the Middle East right now. But we have to be true to our values. We have to recognize that authoritarianism wasn't, in the final analysis, stable, and keep working with those more democratic forces to try to help them stabilize and move forward. I think the main thing is that President Bush was committed from the very beginning. I do think that there was some slowness to recognize what was happening in the Middle East with the administration, but they seem to be in the right place now.
In Afghanistan, of course, where Obama's announced withdrawals, at the same time he's trying to negotiate with the Taliban. Does that make any sense?
Eventually, there will probably have to be some kind of reconciliation of elements of those who fought the government. That's true in almost any war, to end a war. But you have to be awfully careful in Afghanistan, because right now the Taliban is still heavily dependent on and infiltrated by extremists, so many with blood on their hands, whose goal is to overthrow the Afghan government. And so I think you want to do that from a position of strength, not weakness. It's why the first order of business ought to be to strengthen the Afghan security forces, use whatever time we have there to make sure that they can prevent an existential threat to the Afghan government, and then perhaps some kind of reconciliation talks might make sense. But you don't ever negotiate with an adversary from a position of weakness.
And speaking of which, President Obama, on the one hand, certainly has stepped up the Predator program, but in general, his sort of touchy-feely approach to world affairs, his apologizing, does that make the U.S. more vulnerable to attack?
I think there's an evolution here in the administration's policy. Look, the United States of America is not going to be popular. That's the wrong goal. The United States of America has to be respected, and it has to be predictably there for its friends and tough on its enemies. And I think that that's now becoming clearer to the administration. They reached out a hand of friendship to the Iranians at the beginning. The Iranians essentially bit it off. And so now you see efforts to do many of the things that we were doing, which is strengthening the sanctions regime against the Iranians. If indeed, as I fully believe they did, the Iranians were implicated in trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, really rallying the world around that, because we know what kind of regime this is. And it's not a regime that can be dealt with except from a position of strength.
Your friend Dick Cheney told me in an interview that Israel would bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities if we don't. And he said, he has had discussions with Israeli leaders, and that's what that's based on. What would the U.S. position be, or should be, in that kind of situation?
Well, it's difficult to say and to have a hypothetical like that, because I think for the time being the Israelis have decided to try to let diplomacy work, but diplomacy has to work, and it has to be tough diplomacy with teeth. Because I don't have any doubt that the Israelis will defend themselves if the Iranians look as if they really are about to cross that nuclear threshold. There is some not bad news in that it looks as if there are problems in the Iranian nuclear program. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has talked about those. But pressure on the Iranian regime is an absolute must, because the unintended consequences of an attack of Israel on Iran, the very fact that we talk about something like that, shows how extremely important and crucial this issue really is.
Mm. Do you suspect that the CIA might have introduced some of those viruses to cause problems in the nuclear program?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what may or may not have happened, but the Iranians are boastful about what's going on there, but I do believe that there are lots of ways to slow their program, including, by the way, embargoing a lot of the materials that they might need to complete their program.
And if extremists take over Pakistan, what about the nuclear weapons there? And is it possible that the U.S. might have also introduced some kind of way to block their nuclear weapons?
Well, it's well known that we have talked with the Pakistanis about nuclear safety, as we have with a number of countries, and I think that's really the way to handle this. There's generally a view by people who study Pakistan, know the place, that the military is quite in control of the more dangerous, their most dangerous weapons. But of course, Pakistan is a very unstable place, and if I worry a lot about one place, it's really Pakistan, and the kind of depth of extremism in some of those institutions. But there's no indication that I know of extremists having that kind of scope to threaten the nuclear safety of the country.
Mm-hmm. You know, way back when I interviewed you for one of my books, I mentioned that Colin Powell was leaking a whole bunch of very nasty things about the Bush administration, and you are pretty nice to him in your book. And of course Dick Cheney fingered him to some degree. But really it was like walking into the DNC to listen to him and his staff. Does that surprise you, or?
Well, I just don't agree. I mean, I think Colin Powell is a patriot, and he may have views with which some don't agree. But this is a man who has always stood for American power. After all, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when we threw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 1991. He was the one who, for the president, went before the Security Council, made the case about weapons of mass destruction when we went to war against Saddam the second time. But, you know, there are structural differences in being Secretary of State sometimes. As Secretary of State, you try to make diplomacy work, and sometimes people don't really agree with that. But I think Colin Powell is a fine patriot, and I never personally saw him do anything that would hurt the president.
Hmm. You wrote in your book about Dick Cheney pushing to show complicity by Saddam in the 9/11 attacks. What was on his mind?
Well, I don't know. I think the vice president was reading a lot of raw intelligence, you know, the inputs to what become then intelligence assessments. And there are always nuggets here and nuggets there that are enticing toward a story that had some plausibility, that Saddam Hussein might indeed have had something to do with 9/11. But the great weight of evidence by the intelligence folks and everything that I saw was that he probably didn't. That didn't mean that there was no link between Iraq and the war on terror, which is where people try to go with that, because After all of this had come out of the kind of al-Qaeda. After all, bin Laden was a Saudi, Zawahiri was an Egyptian. This had come out of the instability of the Middle East and the freedom gap in the Middle East. And Saddam was certainly responsible as anyone for the conditions in the Middle East that led to this kind of explosion of terrorism.
Were you aware of the FBI agent George Pirro, who interviewed Saddam for 7 months after his capture, and Saddam admitted that he planned on resuming his WMD program and developing a nuclear weapon? Why didn't the administration try to highlight that?
Well, you know, in fact, I'm not sure that it was brought to our attention, or certainly to my attention, and by the time I'd gone over to the State Department by that time. But I'll say this, it doesn't surprise me that Saddam would have said that. The link between Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction was not a theoretical link. We know that he had sought a nuclear weapon and was about a year from developing a crude nuclear device when he was thrown out of Kuwait in 1991. We know he had used chemical weapons against his own people and against the Iranians. And so his intent to maintain this link to WMD, I think, is really unassailable. What we didn't find were stockpiles. He had not obviously reconstituted, as the intelligence said, but he maintained the infrastructure, he maintained the scientist, and he certainly obviously maintained the intent.
And finally, you know, given all your knowledge and how much you care about this country and its security, who would you like to be president?
Well, I think we're in a very interesting period called the primaries, and I, like everybody, am watching to see who will emerge. This is a good process because you get to see people a little off balance. You get to see how they handle pressure. I'm not one who says that the process is too tough. I think you want to see people under these circumstances, and someone will emerge, and we'll have a good nominee, and I'll support the nominee because I'm a loyal Republican.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Always good to see you.
Thank you.